the Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am joined by Sharon Bennett Connolly. Sharon, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you. Thank you for asking me on again.
Yes, I'm excited to speak with you again. It wasn't that long ago that I had you on, and I think we talked about a lot of Margarets, if I recall. Today might be a little easier to remember the names because I wanted to have you on today to talk about Perkin Warbeck. And the reason that I wanted to talk to you about this is I've already told you this is when I went to England in June, I went to the city of Exeter, which by the way is now one of my favorite cities in England. I love it and all the history that's there. And one of the surprise stops that my tour guide friend Nigel had for me was the Exeter Guild Hall. I literally had no idea we were going to be going there. We're just walking up the sidewalk in Exeter, and he said, "Oh, let's stop in here." And I turn and I look and I see a sign and it says, Exeter Guild Hall. And I went, "Oh, well, this should be interesting." Apparently he had prearranged this whole thing for me already. And we walked inside and I got to meet the Mace Sergeant John, who was there at the time. And they had an artifact to show me. I had no idea what to expect. And they take me up the stairs to this glass case. And there's this beautiful sword in the case, and it's in a sheath, and it's beautifully decorated. And I thought, wow. And they're like, well, this is the sword that Henry VII gave the city of Exeter. And I went, oh, I didn't really know anything about this. And I'm looking at this and I'm staring at it thinking it's so beautiful. And the Mace Sergeant turns and he starts to grab it out of the case. And I had this moment of giddy thinking, he's taking this out. I get to see this close up.
Yeah.
And so it was quite amazing to see him lay it out on the table and pull it out and have it there for me to look at closely. My only regret is I didn't have the courage to ask him if I could hold it with his gloves. I wish I had been brave enough, but I think I was just in awe at the time.
All I've had in my head since you told me about it is I would say, "Can I touch it?"
I know. I think I was just in shock. Everything was just like, wow, I can't believe this is happening. So when I go back, maybe that's gonna be the next question that I ask. Why didn't I ask? Why didn't I ask? I mean, it was Henry VII's sword. How cool is that? But the story behind the sword is what made me want to have you on the show and talk about Perkin Warbeck. And so why don't we just kind of start there and, give the listeners a little history on who Perkin Warbeck was, and then we can lead up to the meaning of the sword, if you're okay with that.
Yeah. Well, isn't that the question? Who was Perkin Warbeck?
Yeah, I guess that was really a leading question too.
Talk about a loaded question. Right. I believe Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the younger of the princes in the Tower. So he claimed to be Richard, Duke of York. I don't think he was. Henry VII did a lot of research into him, and he was from the town of Tournai in Flanders. But he had very powerful European backers, including Margaret of York, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, who backed him. He claimed he was Richard, Duke of York. She believed him or agreed with him, or maybe didn't. I'm still not sure that she actually believed him. I'm not sure anyone on the continent believed he was Richard, Duke of York. They just believed that they could create instability in England by backing someone who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York. Interestingly, for those who, and now I'm going to get some enemies, for those who believe that Richard III didn't kill the princes in the Tower, when Perkin Warbeck, Richard, Duke of York, was interviewed about, I think it was in his letter to Isabella of Spain, but I might be wrong, but I know that he said that he explained how he escaped from the Tower, that the two men sent to kill him and his brother killed his brother, Edward V, and took pity on him and spirited him away from the Tower. So if you believe that Perkin Warbeck was Richard, Duke of York, then you also have to believe that Richard III ordered the deaths of the princes and that Edward V was murdered on Richard III's orders. So there's the conundrum.
Yeah. It does get a
So
little
he got,
confusing.
yeah, so he got a lot of powerful backers in Europe. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, um, the King and Queen of Spain, the Duchess of Burgundy, all helped finance him. He came over to Ireland, actually, first to Cork, and proclaimed himself Richard, Duke of York, and King Richard IV. And eventually he made it to Scotland, where he was wined and dined for 19 months by James IV, King of Scots, as Richard, Duke of York. And James IV supposedly believed him, or again, just wanted to upset Henry VII in England. He even gave him one of his distant cousins as a bride, Katherine Gordon. So Catherine was slightly related to the royal family, so she had enough pedigree to be the wife of a prince, but also not enough pedigree so that it didn't matter if he wasn't a prince.
Yeah.
So she was
Yeah.
royal enough, but not too royal. And yeah, he gave his cousin as a bride to Prince Richard, and he backed an invasion of England with Richard, which didn't go well. They invaded England from the north, as you would if you were Scottish. And after 3 days, James IV realised that there wasn't support in England for Prince Richard, came back north of the border, and eventually started negotiating with Henry VII to marry Henry's daughter, Margaret. By which point, Perkin Warbeck, or Prince Richard, was an inconvenience, to say the least. So whether or not he persuaded Perkin to leave Scotland or helped finance Perkin to leave Scotland is open for debate. But basically, after 19 months in Scotland, being wined and dined by the King of Scots, married to the King of Scots' cousin, Prince Richard, or Perkin Warbeck, Prince Perkin.
Yeah, that's what we'll call him.
Yeah, left Scotland with his wife, made for Ireland to try and raise some troops. Didn't manage, found out that Ireland wasn't as open to him as it had been previously, and so made for Cornwall. Now, Cornwall had already risen in rebellion 3 months earlier, which had been subjugated by the Battle of Blackheath near London. Basically, Henry VII had raised taxes in order to finance his invasion of Scotland because of James supporting Perkin Warbeck before the marriage agreement. So, and the Cornish had raised rebellion because they didn't like all the taxes. So they were already ripe for extra rebellion. The Cornish have always had this semi-independence attitude. I'll call it attitude. Now I've upset the Ricardians. I've upset the Cornish.
You're on a roll.
I'm not doing very well tonight, am I? Although I'm sure a few Cornish will go, well, yes, we are rebellious. We should be independent. But they have this little peninsula down on the southwest of England, and they're very much self-contained. So the Cornish have always had separate, to some extent, separate laws as well, because they have Dartmoor, and they have the tin miners on Dartmoor who had laws unto themselves. They were only responsible to the king rather than separate landowners and things. So they've always been different, and they like to be different. So Perkin Warbeck decided that, seeing as the Cornish had already raised rebellion, they might be ripe to do it again. So with just about 100 followers, he landed in Cornwall and started marching north from the south coast to raise rebellion, gathering what he hoped would be forces along the way. Unfortunately, a lot of the Cornish were quite subdued because they'd already had a rebellion and their leaders had been executed. So not all of them wanted to join in another rebellion and risk getting executed again. Well, not again. If you were executed once, that was it.
That's a good point. Good point. Yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah, but basically he dropped his wife off in a nunnery so that she was safe and went on the march trying to raise troops as he went. And as you say, he found himself outside Exeter, by which point the king was already aware that he was in Cornwall and had sent instructions to the Henry, was it Henry Courtenay? Definitely Courtenay, the
One of
Earl
the
of Devon,
Courtneys. Yeah.
to oppose Warbeck. And Courtenay had had intelligence that he believed Warbeck's army was bigger than his. So he retreated inside Exeter to defend Exeter against Warbeck, basically. And Warbeck tried to, for a couple of days, tried to get into Exeter, yet concentrating on the gates, trying to break them down.
Yeah.
Didn't work.
Well, let's explain too, because at this time, if I'm correct, if I remember my history for my trip, Exeter was surrounded by a Roman wall at the time.
Yeah, Exeter had always been very well protected, even now I'm going back a few years, in 1067, 1068, after the Norman conquest, Githa, the mother of King Harold II, who'd been killed at Hastings, had supported her grandsons, Harold's sons, in attacking Exeter.
Mm.
So it had a history of being attacked and strongly defended because they never got in either. So it was a powerhouse of a city and very well defended, the gates well maintained, the castles well maintained. So I'm not sure how Warbeck, it makes you think that Warbeck probably wasn't the most militarily minded person to think that he could get into Exeter when better men had never managed it. So
Yeah, it does make you wonder what his plan was, or if maybe he thought he had someone on the inside who was going to let him in.
Yeah. Well, that is possible because the Earl of Devon, of course, was married to Catherine Plantagenet, Catherine, the
Right.
daughter of Edward IV. So technically, if Warbeck could claim to be Prince Richard and King Richard IV, Courtenay was his brother-in-law.
Yeah, good
So he
point.
may have thought that if Courtenay saw his brother-in-law outside, that he'd let him in. But of course, Courtenay was a Lancastrian. So he probably decided that Warbeck wasn't Prince Richard and that it was better to stay with Henry VII, who was already sending him letters saying that, he knew of what was going on. He trusted Courtenay to prosecute the defence of Exeter, and then he'd actually already sent him instructions to defend Exeter and then harry Warbeck's forces if they moved off elsewhere. So Henry VII seems to have been well apprised of the situation and was already sending extra troops to the southwest. So for Courtenay to change sides, it wasn't politically a wise move anyway. But Warbeck probably thought, if I can raise enough, he probably thought the whole of Cornwall would rise in his name, but they didn't.
Mm.
And so Courtenay, I think, made the sensible decision to stay loyal to the king. I don't think it was much of a decision at all, to be honest. And he's basically holding on to Exeter. I mean, if Warbeck had got into Exeter, he could, of course, have just manned the walls, shut the gates, and stayed there forever until the king starved him out.
Yeah. So what happened? He got to the gates. He
He
couldn't
got to
reach
the
them.
gates, and that's as far as he got. The gates were closed. He tried for a couple of days to get in through I think it was the north and east gates, but I might be wrong. Hold on a minute. I've got Nathan Amin's book here. he does tell me somewhere, and I can't find it now, of
Yeah,
course.
that's okay. We can look it up and find out which ones they were. I mean, like I know the gate where I stood, where I think there's a plaque that says this is where it happened, but I have no
Yeah,
idea what side of the
I
city that.
found it.
Oh, good.
So he concentrated all his forces to break down the gates, focusing in particular on the north and east entrances either side of Rougemont Castle. He even set them ablaze to force entry. But
Interesting.
although the gates were set on fire and would have probably caused a bit of a panic, they still held firm. So the following day, the Earl of Devon, Courtney, updated the king, had fresh assaults upon the two gates that morning, especially the northern gateway, but the city was well and truly defended in the king's name. There was fighting, though. Blood was shed on both sides. And the Earl of Devon actually bragged that for every one of his men hurt, there were at least 20 of Warbeck's men wounded.
Wow, that's quite the braggart.
Yeah, so he lost about 200 men at Exeter. And when you've only got a small force,
Yeah.
200 men is an awful lot. So he gave up and withdrew to Taunton, with the Earl of Devon harrying his back and any stragglers getting, just cut off and cut down by the
Wow.
Earl of Devon's men. And what was happening was they were basically, Warbeck's men were being ushered into a trap because the king had men, Giles Daubney, I think it was, coming from the other direction. So Warbeck's caught in the middle. And when he gets to Taunton, he realizes that his men are demoralized because they haven't actually managed to achieve anything.
Yeah.
And they're beginning to distrust their leaders. The leaders are demoralized because the men that they've actually got under them are not soldiers. They're farmers. They're not armed properly. They're not armored properly. If they actually came up against a trained army, they'd be cut to pieces. So Warbeck decides there's not a lot I can do. Just leaves his army, and he and 60 men decide to ride to the coast to try and get to France. But of course, Henry VII's already ordered the blockades on the coast and Warbeck's fleet to be captured and confiscated. So he gets to near Southampton and finds that there's no way out. So he heads to Beaulieu Abbey and to seek sanctuary.
Is that where his wife was?
No, his wife was in St. Burian's, which is near Penzance.
Okay.
So she'd been just sat there for days waiting to find out what was happening. He was, he'd sought sanctuary at Beaulieu Abbey, and that's where the king found him basically. He was persuaded to give up sanctuary and come out in promise for his life.
I was gonna say, how is he persuaded to leave sanctuary?
Yeah.
You're pretty safe there.
Yeah, it's funny because most sanctuaries in England at the time were for 40 days.
Okay.
You could go churches and abbeys, you could seek sanctuary, and you would give them 40 days and 40 nights. And then after that, you had to either surrender yourself to the law or leave the country, abjure the realm, and never come back, go into exile, and that was it. But Beaulieu Abbey has got a special license so that you could actually live there for the rest of your life in sanctuary and never be forced to leave.
Wow.
So I'm not sure exactly how much, what persuasion he was given, but it may be, Henry could have turned around and said, look, you've got your wife to consider. You've got all your men to consider. You give yourself up and I won't kill everybody, because he is king. He could do that. So, and also, I'm not going to kill you. You will have, because he did he brought him to court. Warbeck wasn't allowed to live with his wife, Katherine Gordon, but they were both allowed to stay at court, given an allowance, given money. And, he wasn't free, but he wasn't in prison either.
That's the part I can't wrap my head around. Why was he kept alive?
Henry didn't kill people unless he had to. I mean, there'd already been the rebellion in 1487 that ended at Stoke Field.
Yeah.
With Lambert Simnel set up as first Edward of Warwick and then Richard, Duke of York. Lambert, he was only a 10-year-old boy at the time. And so once it was established he was a pretender, he was given a job in the royal kitchens and he became a royal falconer in the end. So Henry wasn't, I think it suited him politically to humiliate and denigrate these pretenders, to show that they weren't royal and to treat them as non-royals. So keeping them alive actually shows they're not as big a threat, or rather, I'm too big to be threatened by them. So, but I mean, he only kept Warbeck alive for so long because although he was given a cushy life at court, Warbeck, for some unknown reason, decided to escape. And he left Westminster escaping and made it as far as Sheen, I think it was, and the abbey there, which was something like 7 miles away from where he'd escaped. And he was just sat in there. And so he was recaptured really quickly after just a day or so. By which time, Henry VII's right, well, I was nice to you, and this is how you repay me. So he ends up getting put in the Tower of London. His wife, Katherine Gordon, she'd been put into the household of Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's queen, and prospered from there, basically. She was involved in all the events of the royal family. She was at the betrothal of Henry VII's daughter Margaret to James IV, and she was chief mourner at the funeral of Elizabeth of York a month after that. So Catherine, although she wasn't allowed to return to Scotland, or she chose not to, prospered once she was separated from Warbeck. But Warbeck, like I say, he couldn't seem to avoid conspiracy, although his final conspiracy, apparently, it seems that he and Edward the Earl of Warwick, who was the son of George Duke of Clarence, therefore the nephew of Edward IV, and had a claim to the throne and had been in the Tower of London since Henry VII had took the throne in 1485, and before that wasn't exactly free. They were put in cells either next to each other or one above the other and started communicating and planning an escape. Now, part of me thinks, well, that's just two boys, in the tower chatting, passing the time. And part of me thinks somebody might have given the idea to one of them, because Henry VII was trying to arrange the marriage of his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon. And the Spanish monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, were worried about the Warbeck rebellion and the fact that Warbeck was still alive and the fact that Edward of Warwick was still alive. And therefore, Henry VII's throne wasn't totally secure. So they didn't want to send Catherine to a country that wasn't politically stable. So part of me thinks that there's this conspiracy to get Warbeck and Warwick to start planning an escape and technically put one of them on the throne. How on earth they thought they'd be able to do that, I don't know, with the country obviously hadn't risen when Warbeck came as Prince Richard, so why on earth he thought he would later, I don't know. But it was enough for Henry VII to have evidence enough to execute both of them, Warwick and Warbeck. So it worked out well in the end, but you do wonder if Warbeck had been executed after the Cornish Rebellion, would there have been a need to execute poor Warwick,
Right.
who'd been practically a prisoner since he was 10 years old?
You can't help but feel bad for Edward, Earl of Warwick. Like,
Yeah,
but poor kid. He's just a
yes,
victim of circumstance, really.
yeah. And he was, I mean, a lot of earlier historians, 20th century historians, say he was educationally subnormal or mentally incapacitated. I think he was probably just uneducated. He'd been in prison and restricted communication with people since he was 10 years old. So he just hadn't had that freedom to develop educationally and emotionally. So he would have been easily led. He wanted to be free.
Yeah.
He'd been in prison since he was 10. Of course, he wanted to be free. And anyone who offered him that opportunity, he'd jump at it, surely. So it's like he was a lamb to the slaughter,
Yeah.
and he's the one in the whole conspiracy that I really feel for, because poor kid didn't have a chance. I mean, he was in his 20s by the time he was executed, but he was still so much had never had the chance to live.
Right. Half of his life was spent imprisoned.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, uh, really how his sister Margaret Pole felt about her
Mm,
poor brother. And I guess I don't
yeah.
know enough about her and her history to know if there was ever anything. I mean, she would have been younger at that time too, but if there was ever anything that she said about him or anything that she could have done for him.
Yeah. I think the thing is, she couldn't do anything for him, because if she did, it was she was acting against the crown. So so because she was the daughter of George Duke of Clarence, a traitor as well. So she had to step a fine line to keep herself safe.
Right. And she was
Um,
first cousin to Queen Elizabeth of York.
yeah. So it can't have been easy for her, knowing that her brother wasn't getting a life just because he was a boy. So
Yeah.
for once, the girls and Katherine Gordon and Margaret Pole were actually, it was good to be a girl. You
Yeah.
don't hear that a lot in history.
No, no, because clearly they both survived.
Yeah,
I guess I don't know how long did Katherine Gordon live? Did she have a long life? Do you know?
she had 3 more husbands.
Oh, well.
So, yeah, she died hang on, I've got it here.
I didn't even know she
Yeah,
ever remarried, so.
she died in 1537.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah,
that was
so
40 years after the Warbeck Rebellion.
yeah, so her and Margaret Pole died around the same time,
Yeah.
loosely. You could say that. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Yeah. For women in history who usually don't have their voices heard, in this situation, it was a blessing in disguise.
Yes, at
Unfortunately,
least for Catherine.
yeah. And unfortunately, Margaret Pole, of course, had such tragedy in her life, losing her father
Yes.
and her mother and her brother and
Mm,
and then everything that happened with Henry VIII and the downfall of her family,
yeah.
essentially. Like, I just you can't help but have a bleeding heart for these
Mm,
situations that these people were put in.
yeah. I think with Margaret Pole especially, because you think, at 68, she would have expected to be sat at the fireside with her grandchildren around her,
Yeah.
not executed because her king couldn't get to her son. Because that was basically it. He couldn't get to Cardinal Pole, who was on the continent, so he did the mother in instead. It's like, seriously, she was 68.
Mm. It does seem like when you compare Henry VII to Henry VIII, Henry VII was a much more shrewd politician.
Yes,
He
definitely.
understood how things worked a lot better than Henry. And maybe that's just because Henry was never raised to be king, but I guess neither was Henry VII, was he?
No, Henry VII definitely was not. I mean, Henry VIII knew for a number of years that he was going to be king.
Yeah.
For 6 years he was being trained to be king before he became king. Whereas Henry VII, um, he was. the leading Lancastrian claimant from 1471 onwards.
Yeah.
But how much of a possibility? A lot of things had to fall into place for him to be able to claim the throne. He couldn't have foreseen the death of Edward IV in 1483 and the usurpation of Richard III and the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. There
Right.
were so many, I know a lot of people say Margaret Beaufort planned it all along. It
Yeah.
just, yeah, of course she did.
She's psychic, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. She wanted her son to be king. She didn't. She wanted him to come home. I mean, to actually have to spend your entire life practically with your son in somebody else's care must have been heartbreaking for her. She just wanted her baby home.
Yeah.
And I totally understand that. So I don't see her as this scheming harridan behind the scenes. She, just like Henry VII, he claimed that he saw the possibility in 1483 and he went for it. And yes, at that moment, Margaret Beaufort also backed him and persuaded her husband to back him. Yeah, I don't doubt that she was the one persuading Stanley to go for Henry VII. But when you see at Bosworth, Stanley's waiting until the last minute. He's still unsure until he sees, Richard make that charge. And it's like, actually, if we join now, Richard's got a goner.
Yeah.
Henry's the king, and I'm the stepfather to the king. Stanley took the opportunities just like Henry VII did. But long distance planning? No. And I don't think Perkin Warbeck did much long distance planning either.
The subject of the pretenders and the princes in the tower, I think, is absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
The princes in the tower will be a long enduring question, right? I think. Do you have any idea what it would take for people to be satisfied with an outcome?
No, I
What
don't.
evidence would have to come forward for everybody to go, okay, that's what happened?
I would love somebody to find a letter from Richard III saying, "It's me what did it. I hold my hands up, honest gov." But it's not going to happen.
And if
I
it
think,
did, who would believe it, right?
yeah, exactly. Somebody would say it was a forgery. Unless
Yeah.
Richard III or whoever did it came from the past and stood in a court of law and said, "I'm so and so, I killed the princes in the tower. I've just made a time machine so I can come and tell you," then
Yeah.
nobody's going to believe it. Some will believe it, some won't. There's always those who, and there's arguments on both sides. Your previous guest, Matthew Lewis, will.
Yes, he has his
Well,
own theories, right?
yeah. Well, personally, I think that they were too dangerous for Richard III to leave them alive, even allowing them to go to the continent. I just don't think he would have let them out of his custody, ever.
Do you think there will ever be a time where the present monarch will allow those bones to be tested?
I think if there was ever going to be a time, it'll be sometime during the reign of Charles III. I'm not sure how. I suppose if we knew they weren't the princes in the tower, then there would be other questions. It still doesn't say what happened to the boys, even if they aren't the boys. If they are the boys, then a lot of people are going to be very upset.
Yeah, yeah. And I
But
do
then
wonder.
it doesn't prove who killed them
No, it
or how they
doesn't.
died.
Yeah.
So that'll be the argument. It will be Buckingham will get the blame again, or Margaret Beaufort, or who.
Yeah.
To be honest, I mean, you hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, they should test the bones." I suppose when they did them in the 1920s, they didn't have the technology then to say much about them. And I would question whether we have the technology now to say enough definitive to actually put people to, solve some of the questions. So I think I would say I'd leave it for now until we're even more technologically advanced with DNA and things, to find out more. We tend to assume that we have enough knowledge to find out these things, but there's still that, if they do test the bones now and we lose them because they're exposed to the air and they just crumble to pieces, then we haven't got anything in the future when we have more technology and better forensic science to test them and find some conclusions.
Yeah. Well, and let's be fair too. The story of the Princess in the Tower is something that brings a lot of new people into English history
Yes.
and gets them to travel to England.
Yes.
So it's positive for tourism. So if that mystery stays alive, I
Yep.
would say that's also a benefit to the country to not test the bones. Either
I think,
way, I think it's interesting.
yeah, same here. I think the only way we'll know is when we finally invent time travel and somebody goes back with a video camera or their phone
Yeah.
and actually films what happened to the princess. And then I don't know, somebody still won't believe it.
No, they'll say it's like it.
One side will be satisfied, the other side will say fake news. So
Yeah.
you cannot win. I think part of the mystery is part of the history. And it's what, like you say, it's what draws people in. Everybody has an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they might say, oh, we don't know, but they have an opinion. They either think Richard did it or they think he didn't. So,
Yes.
and of course, we all have people are throwing different ideas in now, that not just whether or not Richard was the killer, whether or not the boys were killed in the first place, whether they were spirited away. It just makes for fascinating discussions and sometimes arguments on Facebook.
Oh, yes.
And between historians, especially Nathan Amin and Matthew Lewis, which is always interesting to watch because I just grab the popcorn.
Yes, I
sit
love
back and
those two.
leave them to it
Yeah.
and think, I'm going back to the 13th century because these kind of arguments don't happen there. Oh, unless it's about King John.
I love this subject so much. And I'm so grateful that you came on to talk about Perkin Warbeck because he is just another one of those figures from history, whether you believe he was Richard or not. I've always thought that maybe he could be, but I don't know that I'd have a good argument as to why I think that. And so it's always you're on one side or the other. Most
But
people
if
don't
you
say.
think he was,
Yeah.
then Richard definitely killed Edward V. So, because Perkin Warbeck said that. So,
Right.
you know,
So, yeah.
it's a double-edged sword.
It really is. Oh, it'll always be a fun topic of discussion amongst guests, won't it?
Oh, yes. I run a Facebook group, King Richard III and the Wars of the Roses, and every time the princes come up in that, it's like, oh, great, I've got 3 days of keeping the peace.
Yes, it's funny that you say that because I just posted some pictures from Westminster of Margaret Beaufort's tomb, and the first comment I got on there was that she killed the princess in the tower, and that just started it. And I was like, oh gosh. Okay, delete. We're not going there. This is not even worth the arguments because then it just gets mean and it gets ugly and nobody knows. So
exactly.
what do you do? Well,
it does make for an interesting conversation.
It really does,
discussion.
doesn't it?
Well, and there are so many possibilities.
Oh, there are. Well, Sharon, you've written a lot of books, so I want to give you an opportunity to plug your work. If anybody wants to find out what you've done, where can they find it?
Well, I'm on Amazon. I have a blog, historytheinterestingbits.com. I also do a podcast, A Slice of Medieval, with my co-host Derek Burks, and we do discuss the princess, not the princess in the, we have never done an episode on the princess in the tower, but Derek is an expert on the Wars of the Roses. So we've done many things around the princess in the tower, but we're both like shied away from, I think one day we will have Matt Lewis and Nathan Amin on together and just say, have at it, boys.
Yes, that's
that
the
would
way.
be interesting. I'm on Twitter as @thehistorybits, Threads, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. I'm everywhere.
Everywhere. And be sure if you go on her blog to follow it or subscribe, because then I get all of your articles in my email, which I always love to get when they pop up in there, and so I could read them.
Yes, and thank you. Like I said, you did see that I'd used you as one of my sources for my latest article on Mary Seymour, the daughter of Catherine Parr.
Yes.
I don't know if you'd noticed that you're actually in the bibliography of my last book, Heroines of the Tudor World.
I didn't. Well, thank you very much.
But yes, you are in the bibliography. So, because I put down wherever I get my information, and even if it's online, if it's websites, and your website was ever so useful. So it's right. Rebecca Larson. Yep.
Oh, I love that. Oh, thank you, Sharon. That's great. Well,
You're welcome. Thank you.
If you're listening today and you've enjoyed Sharon as a guest on the show, talking about her vast knowledge on all things medieval and Tudor, she knows a little bit of everything. Please check out her website. We'll include a link in the show notes and links to her Amazon page as well, so you can buy some of her books. Sharon, thank you so much for being on today.
All right, I am in the Exeter Guild Hall right now with John, and John has pulled out this amazing artifact for me. John, can you tell everybody what it is we're looking at right now?
It's Henry VII's sword, which was given to the city in 1497 after the Perkin Warbeck rebellion. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be one of the two boys locked away by Richard III in the Tower of London, the only one of the two. He rebelled against him in 1497. The city stayed loyal to the crown, and Henry actually brought this down to the city and gave it to the city after that event.
It's amazing now that I've seen the wall and I understand what Perkin Warbeck was coming up against and how the city stood behind the king. No wonder why he gave them such an amazing piece.
Yes.
John, thank you for telling us about this.
Well, that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. As a patron, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, some patron-exclusive content, and even discounts on upcoming webinars and lectures. Head on over to Patreon today to find out more information. And for as little as $3 a month, you can show your support. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.